Adoptee Network. We're glad you're here. Again, those of you that are just now joining us, please go ahead and give us a shout out in the chat room where you're calling from. We have Pam is with me this evening. Jennifer is not with us tonight, so we're going to skip the disclosures that we normally do. Most of you here know us pretty well and know what we do every Friday night, so we'll go ahead and skip all of that. But we did want to go ahead and just start in. We have two amazing guests this evening. We have Amanda, and I hope I pronounced your name correctly.
It's all right.
It probably does it get butchered sometimes. Amanda, is it true?
Transue-Woolston.
Transue-Woolston.
Yep.
And Stephanie Oyler, correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we've got a great topic and an unusual one tonight, the second wave of mother loss, how adoptees' grief repeats itself as our parents age. And that's something that we haven't discussed here in any of our Zoom calls. So we're looking forward to that. We're going to go ahead and just turn the conversation over to the two of you, and welcome.
Thank you. Before Stephanie gets started with introducing us, I wanted to make a quick disclaimer that we both have small children. And they have been cooped up with us since March. So even though they've all been, thoroughly threatened to behave themselves, they may not. So we just want to put that, if you hear screaming in the background, no one's being harmed. It's children. Okay, anyway. And also this is a grief and loss and death topic. So just this is, I feel like everybody's been fairly warned, but I just want to acknowledge that up front. So Stephanie is going to start us off with talking about herself.
Okay, so hey everybody, my name's Stephanie. I was born in 1990 to my first parents. Around the age of 2 weeks, I was taken into something that's not around anymore, but it was called respite care. It's kind of like a short-term babysitting thing through the county because my first mother went into an postpartum mental health crisis and went inpatient. So I then went through a few respite placements, and then they officially put me into foster care. I was adopted transracially just before turning 4 years old. Growing up, I struggled with the core issues that we hear about from a lot of different adoptees, which were actually overdiagnosed and treated as mental illness when they weren't actually that. And this included being placed in alternative schools and residential treatment facilities, which is a common reality for young adoptees and foster youth. As an adult, I obtained my bachelor's in social work, and then I moved on to get my master's in social work. I reunited with my first mother about 11 years ago when I turned 18. I went through the county that I was adopted through. So I currently lead the clinical support to all members of the adoption constellation pre and post for my county's adoption unit. I also actually work in the county that I was adopted out of, which is kind of full circle. I own Adoptee Lit LLC, which provides consultation and education to families impacted by adoption. And I co-own Roots Incorporated with Amanda, through which we co-host an upcoming adoption podcast, as well as the Motherloss project that we're doing now. I live in the greater Philadelphia area with my husband, who's a registered nurse, and our 2 children.
And I was born in 1985. We were just going over how I'm not really that much older than her, but it still makes me feel old. But anyway, I was surrendered to foster care 3 days after birth. And so I've learned to, that my first mother feels respected when I add on a little addition to that. She didn't know she was placing me in foster care. And so she feels a lot of shame when I say that I went into foster care, because she thinks it implies that I was taken because she did something wrong. So I've learned to kind of add that because there's what objectively happened, but then there's also how she feels most respected. So I was in foster care for about four and a half months. And I was then placed with my now adoptive parents, and then they legally adopted me in 1986. And I had a lot of mental health challenges, behavior challenges, and also trauma as a child and the trauma was from, in addition to adoption loss, also just severe bullying at school as a child. And there wasn't adequate help for me. I didn't get help until I was an adult, and I figured out how to find it. And that was a strong influence in terms of my interest in social work and mental health. I too have a bachelor's and a master's in social work. I reunited with my original families just over 10 years ago. Currently, I'm faculty for several colleges. I teach social work, sociology classes, and psychology classes. I founded the Lost Daughters Writing Project, and I'm the author of the Declassified Adoptee book and blog. And then I work on Roots Incorporated and Motherloss with Stephanie. And I also live in the greater Philadelphia area with my husband and my 2 children. So in our talk today, we want to highlight something that we're calling, you see it in the title of the program, the second wave of mother loss. And so please know first that this was not to intentionally exclude fathers or parents who are elsewhere on the gender spectrum. Both of us recently lost our mothers, and both of us are reunited with our first mothers, and also, but not our first fathers. So there is a strong mother theme there. Traditionally, as a lot of you probably already know, adoptees tend to focus more on mothers, and so did the OG attachment theorists like John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. So mother loss. In our brief adoptee elevator stories that we just gave to you, you saw our first wave of mother loss. You saw how we lost first mothers and also foster mothers. For Stephanie, it was even more than one respite mother and more than one foster mother. But as adoptees, we've now gone through that loss again as adults. As I said on my Facebook page, because I'm adopted, I will lose more than one mother more than one time throughout my lifespan. And I don't want to sound morbid, but I want to put, and some of you may already be in this place, but I have a first mother who's alive and well, and Stephanie has an adoptive mother who's alive and well. And I've already told myself I don't want to go through this again. But as an adult with aging parents, we both do not have that choice. So I'm going to have to repeat this for my adoptive father. I'm going to have to repeat this for my stepfather who's married to my first mother. And I'm going to have to repeat this for my first mother as she ages. And it keeps repeating itself. We desire to give words and feelings and acknowledgement and labels, and even some ability to plan for future losses to our fellow adoptees. And so that's why we've decided to try and, can we create a framework that can help break down and identify some of, just even a fraction of kind of the losses that we go through that aren't acknowledged or seen, or that we didn't even see coming ourselves. And so we're really honored to be able to share kind of the rough beginnings of that framework here with you today in this happy hour that we're doing with you today. And so Stephanie is going to introduce that framework to you.
Yeah, so as Amanda mentioned in our introduction, that we're working on the framework for understanding our loss experiences immediately as a parent death is either impending or as it happens. We wanted our framework to help people understand how death of a first adoptive parent may differ for adoptees than it is for non-adoptive people. But we also want to learn and to help people understand how the death may affect the adoptee differently depending upon if the parent is a first parent or an adoptive parent. Amanda, why does this matter?
The reason why this matters is because anytime a grieving person experiences a loss that others don't realize is a loss, or they just don't understand how you lost anything, it creates something that, again, I think a lot of adoptees, especially those here, have heard before: disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is a term that was coined by grief research Dr. Kenneth J. Doka, and it refers to grief that has to be done privately, in secret, just unacknowledged, or really just it's not attended to at all, because the grieving person is the only one that sees it, right?
So disenfranchised grief is similar to the concept of ambiguous loss, which is the term coined by Dr. Pauline Boss. People with ambiguous losses feel frozen, stuck, and unable to process their losses. This can happen with others around them, or even the grieving person themselves doesn't fully understand the nature of their loss and grief. And I can say that for me, this definitely happened with my first mother, as I had to speak to different family members and friends, and they would kind of look at me blankly like, well, what do I say? Like, are you sad? Because they didn't understand how a person who didn't raise me could cause so much sadness and grief. Disenfranchised grief and ambiguous loss are already known experiences for adoptees, right, Amanda?
Yeah, and like Barbara was saying in the chat, it's our first mothers understand what that's like too, because not only were they gone from us, but we were gone from them, and it feels very much like an absent person, like a death, but they're still living. And of course, when I was a kid, I would listen to the news and hear about someone dying or someone being killed and go, I wonder if that's my mom. I wonder if that's my family member. And my first mother would do the same. And it's like, do I grieve or do I not? Like, because you don't have the answers. Ambiguous loss, which I'm going to talk about next, disenfranchised grief, it's all very difficult. For some of us in closed adoption, navigating life, knowing we have a set of parents out there that exist, but that we've never seen, is that ambiguous loss, that similar concept. When an adoptee is searching for a first parent and they find a grave, similar to the experience that you described, Stephanie, people may say to them, well, at least you don't have to mourn someone you never got to know. Which in reality, adoptees do mourn when they find that a first parent died before they could meet. And now their grief is disenfranchised. I know you can empathize with that.
Yeah, we as adoptees already spend so much time explaining and educating about the losses of our first parents and even foster parents as children. Now we're faced with doing the same thing when our adoptive parents and our first parents and even our foster parents die when we're adults. The more understood adoptees feel while grieving, the harder that grief is. We as adoptees and therapists, of course, want to improve the quality of life of fellow adoptees any way that we can, and that's why this Motherloss project is so important to us. So back to our framework, what does that look like?
So I have created a visual, and I wasn't sure how or if I was going to be able to link it, but it will be available on our social media, and if there's a way to send it out to the your mailing list, it will be made available. But we're going to visually walk it, verbally, imaginatively walk you through it anyway. So I'm going to describe it. So the first step, and this is really deeply introspective, right? Because Stephanie and I have just gone through this, and so we're actually walking you through what we know to be true personally. And if you can imagine that you're at a sort of crossroads, if you want to describe, you can go this way or you can go this way. Your first parent or your adoptive parent is dying, or they have died, and you're faced with having involvement in that process. So some adoptees, like any other descendant of any other parent, will feel inclined to step in to help, to take over, or to plan or participate in whatever is necessary. And some adoptees, like any other descendant of any other parent, they won't feel inclined to help or to do that. And so Stephanie and I are looking at this using a lens called contextual family therapy to help us understand why some adoptees might go one way and some might go another way, and not shaming the choices that any adoptee makes in between. We want to understand why, because we're all the experts in our own lives. And if we make a choice, my starting point is I want to understand it, not automatically judge that it was right or wrong. And so we want to know why are adoptees going this way and jumping in to help, and why might they decide to go another way?
Yeah, absolutely. And basically, contextual family therapy says that we all have an unconscious ledger in our heads, and where we unknowingly keep track of how much we get from our family and therefore how much we ought to give back. And for adoptees who are wondering, yes, getting identity or anything else about yourself that you value from your first parents does count, even if they didn't raise you. And I can definitely attest to that.
So according to theory and our own experiences, an adoptee at this initial crossroad is asking themselves any number of questions before deciding whether or not to be involved in their parents' end of life or the planning for their arrangements. And some of these questions might be, do I feel inclined or obligated? The founder of Contextual Family Therapy called it like an unconscious loyalty, or he was referring to unconscious loyalty because he had psychodynamic roots. Do I feel obligated to answer the call to be involved? What is obligating me or pulling me to do so? How much involvement am I willing to have? Will I agree to be more involved than I really want to? And why? And how do I navigate the reality of maybe being blocked from, for whatever reason, being prevented from being as involved as I want to or as I really think that I should be? Naj, who is the theorist, the founder of this lens that we're borrowing from Contextual Family Therapy, said that we have invisible loyalties, and that's what he was referring to. The invisibility is the unconscious part to our parents that drive how much we feel obligated or inclined to give back to them. For me, Naj would say that he would probably say, I mean, he's dead, so I can't like speak. Yeah. He would say that I felt an obligation to answer the calls for my adoptive mother's final care and then her arrangements after death because she raised me. Like that would be like an easy kind of superficial explanation. Stephanie, you too, as you mentioned before, you answered that call to make some decisions for your first mother who didn't raise you. And I think people seem most curious about that experience. To a lot of reunited adoptees, they may identify with you a lot. And I think that the way you put that experience into words is really helpful. So can you share about that?
Yeah, to provide a little background, the day I actually received the call about my first mother, I was at work, and it came in from her peer support specialist, who when she was with at the time, she normally would call me because during that time she didn't have a working phone. So the call came in and I stepped out to answer it. Immediately I could hear the panic in the peer specialist's voice. She frantically had said, "You need to come to the hospital. The doctors need your consent to provide life-sustaining measures, and she's not doing well." My immediate thought was she's going to die. And that's how it came across in the conversation. So I rushed out of work. I made the 45-minute drive to the hospital that she was at. And at that time, there weren't any answers. She had rapidly declined and needed intubation as a form of life support. So when I came in, the doctors took my information. They stated they would be calling me at various times to get my consent for things. I realized at that time that, you know, she was doing better than what was portrayed over the phone. So that gave me a little relief. And so she was stable, she was doing okay, and the machine was breathing for her. They were going to keep her sedated to make sure she would rest because due to her mental health challenges, the machines and tubes would give her extreme anxiety. So I don't think I consciously thought about what was going on during that time. I never once thought twice about going to the hospital or answering the call. It did not feel like an obligation in the moment. It felt like something that was needed to save my mom's life. And at the time, and probably throughout those 2 weeks that she was in the hospital, I felt like I was functioning in a state of shock. I was in my final semester of graduate school. I had a license test coming up. I was a full-time caseworker, a wife, and a mom. So nothing around me had stopped in order to really get through it, I think I just kind of removed myself from the emotions. At the time, it was really hard for me to speak to the doctors. I felt like an imposter, like I shouldn't be allowed to be there making these decisions. It felt like each time I walked into the room with the medical team or my mother's case management team, that they were judging and examining me. And of course, at this time, it wasn't true, but that's what it felt like. At times, I felt like I almost had to preface my adoption story to the individuals that I was speaking with. Like, "Hi, I'm Stephanie. I'm her daughter, but I was also adopted, but I have a relationship with her for the last 12 years, and I'm involved with her care." But I never did that, even though I wanted to on so many occasions. And sometimes I felt like, you know, everybody could see straight through me. So it was really difficult.
I identify it, especially with the last part, do I have to explain? For me, I had to remind myself that I also felt compelled to explain, and I had to remind myself that I didn't have to, because nobody knew if I was adopted or not, or nobody it was with my mother, it was a lot of over the phone. So for those who are interested in more of our detailed backstories, we did a 2-part segment for Adoptees On, where we really with Haley went through like more details of the events of our story. So if you're interested in more details, you can check those out. For me, briefly, I lost my adoptive mother in February, and my parents were on vacation in Florida, and they were hit head on by a driver who swerved into oncoming traffic. And when I first got the call about this from the hospitals in Florida, I had thought that both of my parents were dead. And then so I flew there and I sorted things out, and they weren't able to save my mom. But my dad ended up being okay. And so there were a couple questions. I don't just, my parents and I share some attributes in common, but I don't look like their biological daughter. And so there were some nurses over time, because I was there with my dad for 9 days, who would say, well, are you the stepdaughter? Like, I just kind of got weird questions like that every once in a while. And I had to remind myself, like, just say no. They're not entitled to know. And if they're judging you and how much you should be involved or not, like, don't give that to them. Just look at them really weirdly and say no, like, and just move on. And that's just so awkward for me as an adoptee who is often in these situations used to kind of justifying my existence. And so that is my brief kind of story of loss. And so at this point, we've made it past our initial step in like this framework that we're talking about. And so we're past the crossroads. And for us, for the purposes of this discussion, we're going down the avenue of, yes, we both said yes, that we are going to step in. And so there are, to kind of like, what pre-death and death decisions are there to make? And so that we kind of started breaking it down that way. Like, there are planning decisions, and there are handling someone's affairs and their celebration of life, or whatever ritual is important to your family or to your culture. There's so many decisions and tasks that could be put upon you that fall under kind of those categories. And so that gives us where we start out with things to consider, right, Stephanie?
Yeah, it's really important to us to be thorough, because we don't want to miss, you know, anything that could be unseen grief or just a stressor in general for the grieving adoptee. So we broke things down into 3 columns, and we're looking at the decisions we as adoptees have to make over time: pre-death, post-death, and just ongoing things we have to manage. So we're also looking at the practical aspects of those decisions, and then we're also looking at the deeply personal and emotional aspects having to make those decisions puts adoptees through.
Yeah, to help people empathize and just, I guess, fully imagine what kinds of decisions and like the sheer number of decisions that could come our way, we made a list of domains of human life that give us a starting place in what kind of decisions that we have to consider could impact somebody. And so we get, for the people who are therapists or social workers, you might, when we start talking about it, you might recognize this as being from the holistic model, but basically we want to touch every aspect of being human and realize that planning for death and dealing with death it helps us be more thorough.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to empathize with an adoptee through a parent's pre-death and post-death, you have to think of all the medical, psychological, social, spiritual, cultural, legal, and financial decisions there are to make. On top of that, think about our rights and ability to make those decisions may differ depending on whether the parent who died is a first parent or an adoptive parent. We're not even into the personal aspects yet, and it's already so much.
Yes, it is a lot. For the personal aspects, so we're going for like, what are all the ways being human can affect us handling the death and dying process of a loved one. And so we use the holistic model for that. And then for each one of those tasks that we might have to do, such as making the decision about life support, where we then say, hey, what's the emotional aspect of being adopted, or more than one that could be brought up by this? And we are using something called the 7 core issues of adoption, which both Stephanie and I were trained in the post-adoption support unit in our county. How does this 7 core issues of adoption help us start out our thinking about what an adoptee could be going through when they are deciding about life support? So depending on what decision needs to be made, we are dealing with, the core issues are loss, rejection, shame and guilt, grief, identity, intimacy, and that in this case could be how close we feel to a parent or to our family, and mastery and control. Mastery and control basically means we feel competent in our ability to make decisions that we have to make? Do we feel entitled to our role in these decisions? Or for some of us, do we feel unfairly robbed of a role in these decisions?
Yeah, so let's give some examples. Going to the pre-death decisions and the legal aspects of having to be your mom's decision maker when she was dying, what did you have to decide, Amanda?
So I wasn't actually asked to decide anything during the process when they were trying to save her. The surgeries that my mom went through, the attempt to try and transfer her to a new hospital, they were all made by doctors who didn't call me, and they didn't include me. And I actually was her legal next of kin. So the law would have supported me in making those decisions. And I also did feel that it was my role to make them. And I can tell you, though, that this is still definitely a mastery and control issue for me, because it was really hard for me not to be able to be involved. So what about you? Was the law technically in your corner? What personally did that experience bring up for you with your mom?
Yeah, I don't think that the law was necessarily in or out of my corner. I don't think anybody actually knew how to approach me or how to approach the situation. I think because there was no other family, my mother had, no family besides me. They kind of just eventually made the executive decision to allow me to fall into the place of making the decisions. No one questioned whether she was actually my first, mother at all, or whether I was related to her. I came in and I kind of, took on that role of making the decisions because there was nobody else at the time to step in. I think it was hard for me to handle the pressure of stepping in to make them, just because it was these were such important decisions, and I felt like it was hard to feel competent in it, just because although I was in reunion for 12 years, I didn't know my mom's full medical history. I didn't know the full medication list or the scope of her diagnosis over the years. I mean, I didn't even know my full family history. So it was difficult to not feel like, is it okay for me to step in? Is it not? Eventually, I did have to make the decision to remove her from life support, and it was a really hard decision to make. But law, I mean, I don't even know if there's a law that would have prevented me, because it wasn't something that came up when I was speaking to everybody.
In terms of post-death decisions that involve culture, your mom faced stigma from poverty and also from mental illness that then in turn you had to face upon her death. As an adoptee in reunion, what did that bring up for you?
Yeah, I was told during my childhood that my parents loved me very much, but they were sick and they couldn't take care of me. And I understood this at the time from a childlike mindset, but as an adult, And especially when I began to move into my education as a social worker, so many more things clicked into place. My mother was involved in systems her entire life. Very, very early on, she was placed into the child welfare system herself and spent years in and out of institutional settings in foster care. She then aged out and moved directly into the adult welfare system. So when I began reunion with her, she was a part of various agencies and had a professional team. The 2 years before her death, I actually joined her team of supports and began to attend all the update and treatment plan meetings. When an individual doesn't have a family and is involved with the level of care that she was, it's really difficult to be treated fairly and with respect. So there was a time that I had to go to the group home in which she was staying at and demand to meet with the director, explain, very firmly that she's no longer alone. I'm not going to stand for her to be treated anything but with respect and dignity. And it definitely took them by surprise, but she never had somebody do that. So they weren't ever, it was never something that crossed their mind. When my mother passed, I was faced with the reality that now I'm in charge of doing all the arrangements and after plans. And due to the poverty and the mental illness and the lack of a steady income outside of disability, she had no savings, she had no assets, she had no wealth. I was speaking to the hospital chaplain for weeks as we tried to figure out the next steps. I was doing it alone. There was no help, no other family members. And during the course of her treatment and decline in the hospital, she was moved to a hospital even further out, which was about 2 hours. So I took multiple trips to the ICU over that 2-week time period. And the chaplain informed me that my mother may qualify for her cremation to be fully covered by the medical insurance due to the circumstances of her situation. But what we didn't realize at the time is that even though she was in this hospital and out of county, it was our county that needed to look into this. So our county coroner was not answering the phone, and it came to a point where the chaplain explained that our time was up and they would have to basically dispose of her, and I would not get her ashes, and she would be put into a mass grave. So she would be, in a sense, thrown out, which was a horrible feeling for me, and I felt completely powerless. But literally the 11th hour, the coroner got back to us on the day and informed us she was covered and would be transported back. So the whole process was probably the most stressful and unnerving thing I had to go through. The idea that my mother could be thrown out because she was not wealthy or didn't have a large extended family, it really hurt me. Her life circumstances shouldn't have to dictate the care she received, both at the end of life and during the process of celebrating her life and making final arrangements. However, it did. She was poor. She didn't have anybody in her corner besides myself, and had extreme mental health issues. And because of that, a lot of people looked at her like she was another case and expendable. So I know Spiritual Decisions brought up some core adoption issues for you when you were planning your adoptive mom's funeral. What was that like for you, Amanda?
Yeah, my mom's funeral was this past Sunday. And I want to acknowledge that because we're talking about an adoptive mother and also a first mother, that there are cultural differences there too. There are different traditional silos of power and privilege that just come with being in a place of being able to afford to adopt and raise a child, or being mentally well enough to do that, or not having the stigma of mental health and being able to raise a child, and someone who is not able to raise their child because of poverty and mental health stigma. And so the things that are challenging for me right now are very real and heavy for me, and they're hard to carry, but they are kind of more superficial feeling in that way. And so just imagine like a moment of empathy that for someone like me my mother had more privilege than Stephanie's mother. Stephanie is also carrying all the things that I am, in addition to the burden of the stigmas and the difficulty with distance and poverty that she just described. And so that is also like a really important layer that we want to touch upon. It's because I didn't have to overcome that poverty and those mental health stigmas that I'm able to focus on something such as like my own spiritual needs, which it can get neglected for some people who have to focus on things that are more survival based because of oppression in society. I speaking of like spirituality and my mom's funeral, I went through a lot of guilt and shame and also identity issues. You know, as Stephanie already foreshadowed, there were emotional aspects of the death and dying or the post-death planning process having to do with the spiritual domain of being human. Within, like, I wrestled with two competing thoughts during that planning process. I did almost all the planning for my mom's funeral by myself, which was really hard, you know, during a pandemic and feeling alone anyway. And a lot of my relatives were like sending me things, which is, it's fine, but they were sending me things like do this and do that because I can't come. And so I'm trying to make everybody happy. And so along the lines of those competing thoughts, I know, and people, and I've even told people myself that funerals are for the living. And so I asked myself, what do I need the funeral to be like so that I can try and get some sort of closure? And in my small corner of American culture, we don't see the rituals at a funeral as having an impact on the spiritual afterlife of the dead person. So the funerals are for the living concept is something that's encouraged in my family, in my circle. But at the same time, like, there's a competing thought in my mind, what would she have wanted? And the unfortunate fact of the matter is, what I feel helped by and what my mom would have wanted are two very different things. My mom's faith and church were some of the most significant aspects of her entire life. And I don't feel that my spiritual needs are met in the same way. There was also some family conflict over that. Like, Amanda, you need to say this, you need to promote this idea. And I just was I was just so uncomfortable with it. And so some family members did take issue with me over that. And that enhances the guilt and shame that I'm choosing between being true to myself or doing what my mom would have wanted. And so I feel selfish. And also the identity issue of, it's another reminder that I have always felt that I don't belong. And also the intimacy issue of, well, does my aunt or does this person really know my mom better than I do? That they're saying this is what she would have wanted and I'm not advocating for the same thing. Maybe I'm not really as close to my mom as I thought I was. And those are all very painful things for any daughter to have to think about. Especially being adopted and having the abandonment and the fitting in kind of issues, especially when your parent is no longer there to reassure you that things are okay and that they do love you and that you do belong. Now I'm in the place of providing reassurance for myself, and I don't know that I'm being tested. Am I all that good at it? So none of those things are comforting when they pop into your mind and your body when you're grieving. Of course, the pandemic didn't help, but, you know, so Stephanie, what decisions are on your plate right now? And how does being an adoptee kind of pop in to your mind and body when you're making those decisions?
Yeah, as I said earlier on, I think that, at least for me, imposter syndrome was really very real. I felt out of place and uncomfortable. I felt that people wouldn't think I was appropriate to make the decisions, and it was a hard feeling to handle. When I began the process of collecting her belongings from the group home that she had stayed in, I had to go through many different people, and no one had a real answer of whether I was allowed to retrieve the things or not. However, there wasn't anybody else to do it. So eventually they allowed me to come and get her things. And when I arrived at the group home, I realized that they had already cleared her room out and her things were shoved in a cleaning closet with mops and toilet plungers. And they handed me a computer chair on wheels and watched me struggle as I carried her things and the fridge out. They sat in the office and looked. And I think that they all knew that I was adopted. And I don't think, I just wonder if I had been her, you know, a daughter that she raised, if they would have treated that differently. I'm now in the process of finding out how I want to honor her. It'll just be myself and my husband and my children, and my younger birth sister, who's, you know, also her daughter, may choose to come, but I'm not sure how to handle the next step because I'm learning along the way. So, what about you, Amanda?
So, in sharing kind of like what I'm focused on right now, that's going to be the last kind of example piece that we share. And then Stephanie is going to conclude because I know that we are almost at the end of our time. So just to conclude and also point out the differences between being an adoptee who's managing for an adoptive family member and adoptee who's managing for a first family member, you're going to notice an element of privilege. And we saw how, Stephanie, your items were treated, or your mother's items were treated, and that kind of the stigma that caused people to kind of just disregard the items. And then we see kind of the position I'm in, where my adoptive mother could never really let go of anything. And she has all of her own belongings, but she also has both of her parents' belongings, and she has all of their parents' belongings that were passed down to them. And so I have boxes and boxes and boxes of family heirlooms that go back hundreds of years. And to me, as someone who never thought I was going to have those types of belongings for my biological parents, it's like treasure to me. And I also really identified with my grandfather, who was raised at a home for fatherless boys, it was called. And he also was very close friends with several orphan train riders. And so I felt that he identified with me, and I felt that I identified with him growing up. And so I'm drawn to these items. But like, going back to like the feelings, the guilt and shame from feeling selfish, and the identity, I struggle when I think about keeping the heirlooms. Is it wrong of me to keep them? Should I make sure that they go to the biological descendants of these ancestors instead? I want to, like, this comes from my wondering if my descendants would really value these heirlooms as much as the genetic descendants would, and also what would my ancestors have wanted for these items. And because I'm trying to be respectful, and I'm also projecting insecurities into the unknown and asking questions that can't really be answered. And it's difficult to process.
Yeah, so as we're coming to the end of our presentation, I just wanted to kind of recap. We've discussed the second wave of mother loss, and by this we mean we lost our mothers, our first mothers, our foster mothers, our adoptive mothers, and now as adults, we are faced with losing our adoptive mothers and first mothers again in death, but with all of the added complexities that adoption presents. So adoption, its complexities last a lifetime. They do not stay confined to our childhoods. And so we've started out this empathy building process with fellow adoptees by thinking of all the aspects of dealing with death there are, and then asking ourselves, how does adoption complicate these things? And lastly, we're paying special attention to the added differences depending on whether it's a first parent who we're mourning or an adoptive parent. So it's really important to us to hear your questions and to get your feedback. So we thank you for listening and look forward to questions.
Great, thank you both so much. We all want to offer our sympathy to both of you and your losses, and we commend you for your bravery for coming on and sharing, especially so close after these deaths. And it means so much to all of us to have you both here tonight and share. This is such, I mean, what an awareness. And I don't even know what to say. I mean, I learned so much. I took quite a few notes, and I definitely want to make sure that I listen to the replay. But I don't want to take up all the time. I want to open it up to questions, because I know we have many, and I know Pam has a comment she would like to start off with. And please raise your hand if you have a question for Amanda or Stephanie.